Lead Generation 101. PACE has partnered with McMurray and Schuster, the PACE Legal Counsel, to provide a monthly compliance and regulatory webinar series. During this series, we're discussing the latest in news regarding the complicated and constantly changing regulatory environment that affects all of us in the contact center industry. We have all the compliance seminars for 2019 listed on the PACE website, and we'll be updating with further details as necessary. We have a few housekeeping items today. First of all, everyone is on mute, and so if you have questions, you can, on the chat box on the right-hand side, you can ask your questions, and at the end of the webinar will allow 10 to 15 minutes for questions if you have them. The webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on the PACE website in a few days. And if you'd like to receive the slides from today's webinar, you can send me an email at stewart.discount@paceassociation.org, and I will be happy to send them to you. A couple things. We have some non-members on today's call as we opened it up to those companies who are in the lead generation sector of the contact center industry, and we welcome you today. We also encourage you to take a look at PACE membership for what we offer and the value we provide. The lead generation, discussions on lead generation are important right now, considering some actions by the FTC and Congress actually. So being a member, we will provide you with updated information and actually be a voice for the industry to make sure that there's reasonable regulation and making sure that our voice is being heard in Washington. So please, you can go onto our website, www.paceassociation.org, and find out more information. You can contact me, and just to know that we are focusing on this industry and making sure that our voice is heard. We also have a Washington Summit, September 22nd to the 24th, where the lead generation topic will be part of our discussion. And Andrew Smith, who is the Chief of Consumer Protection for the Federal Trade Commission, will be addressing us on Tuesday morning, September 24th. And he has some thoughts that you may have read about the lead generation efforts. So it would be great if you could join us there. And our registration is open right now, and hotel rooms are open. And our summit is probably the premier compliance seminar in the contact center industry every year, and this will be no different. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers today, and if you've been on these webinars, you know them very well. Michelle Schuster, who is legal counsel for PACE and a partner in the firm of McMurray and Schuster, and Josh Stevens, also a member of the firm, who does a whole lot of stuff for PACE. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys.
Thanks, Stuart, and welcome everybody today. We have a very exciting topic that is one of those cutting-edge issues that we thought was so important that we moved the schedule around for the GC webinars that we're doing for PACE this year, and that's lead generation. It's a topic that's been in the news a lot lately. Josh is going to talk about how this has become a focus for the FTC in recent months and a priority for the new director, Andrew Smith, that Stuart mentioned. Also, if you're paying attention to the federal bills regarding the TCPA that have proceeded through committees, the TRACE Act was approved by the Senate, and we now have the TRACE Act and the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act in the House waiting for further action, which we suspect will happen relatively quickly. But in the Stopping Bad Robocalls bill, what type of consent can be given by who and who that applies to and how it can be revoked is one of the topics that will be dictated to the FCC to address in rules if the Stopping Bad Robocalls Act is passed as it's currently existing in the House. So it's a very hot topic. We also know that the state AGs are looking at this issue. They have requested information from federal regulators about enforcement actions that have occurred on the federal level. So I really can't overemphasize how critical this is if we in the contact center are relying on leads that are provided to us to make telephone calls. And sellers, if you are relying on leads to have the proper consent to make those calls through contact centers, it's even more so important to you. The reputational damage for TCPA, causes of action, or worse, regulatory actions are huge, not to mention the monetary costs. We also know that class action attorneys are focusing on this topic of consent. When a TCPA action is filed, one of the first items that counsel for the defense is going to look at is, did we have consent to place this telephone call? And frequently, counsel has not looked at that consent in advance. I think that's starting to change now. But frequently they haven't, and they're relying now on this consent to put forth a defense that they had consent to call a plaintiff, and therefore there should be no TCPA cause of action. If that consent is not good, then class actions are much more easily maintained, because if the consent isn't good from the start, then for every call made thereafter, it's not good. So really just cannot overemphasize how important this topic is, how important it is for those of us that are involved in compliance in the contact center world to understand what's required, and then to ensure that our entities are complying with those regulations. And so I'm hoping that you'll have a really good background on that by the time we get done with our webinar today. Josh has been an integral part of the strategy that we are putting together in the lead generation space. PACE is working to finalize a white paper that's going to advocate for standards in the lead generation industry. This will be the backbone of our advocacy efforts with regulators. That will be released to the membership sometime in the next week or so as that's approved, but you can expect that very soon. And hopefully, as those standards get out into the industry, it will help to level set and put everybody on an equal playing field as it relates to lead generation and what should be legally acceptable. So with that very extensive background, let's go ahead and get started with our Lead Generation 101 presentation today. As always with these webinars, we are not providing legal advice, but rather are educating our members on a topic that's important to them. If you do have specific legal questions, we always recommend that you seek the advice of your attorney. As far as the agenda goes today, obviously as we're talking about lead generation, we're talking about obtaining consent for purposes of where the hot enforcement actions have been lately. That's with the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, and under the TCPA, we're required to have prior express written consent for marketing messages. So that's a large focus of what we'll be talking about today. How do you get it? How should you maintain it? And also what type of revocation issues could exist. The FTC, as I said, has been active in this area. Josh is going to talk about their recent sweep that involved 94 enforcement actions in conjunction with state AGs. It was a pretty far-reaching enforcement action, and it put lead generation squarely at the forefront of the issues there. And then we'll talk about what you should do to reduce risk, because ultimately that's what we're trying to do here. We are trying to make sure that we have policies and procedures in place that we have trained our employees about that are going to help us sleep easier at night, because we know that we've reduced the risk that we're going to face some type of regulatory action or, God forbid, class action lawsuit. So with that, Josh, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Michelle, for that intro. And as Michelle mentioned, prior express written consent is critical to this whole analysis. And so let's start with where we are, because we can't know where we're going unless we know where we are. So a bit of review. Most of you on the call, I'm sure, already know this and can give this part of the presentation as well as anybody else. Prior express written consent is, of course, required for marketing calls and texts to cell phones using an automated telephone dialing system, pre-recorded message, or artificial or synthetic voice. And this might be a bit off topic, but I do want to let people know when it comes to the artificial or synthetic voice prong and pre-recorded message prong, there is a lot of action happening in the courts right now around the use of soundboard technology and finding that that technology is using pre-recorded messages, also around ringless voicemails. So if you use soundboard or ringless voicemails as part of your processes, I would definitely encourage you to talk to your counsel about what's currently going on as to whether those systems are going to require prior express written consent. But getting back to the point that matters for the moment, prior express written consent, of course, requires that you disclose the seller, the number which the called party is consenting to receive the calls, the seller. Let me backtrack a second. The seller, of course, being who's going to call them or whose behalf the call is made. Also, we need to disclose that those calls are being made for a marketing purpose. The technology that's being used, an automatic telephone dialing system, ATDS, or pre-recorded message, artificial synthetic voice, and that consent is not required for purchase. And when we get this consent, we need the consumer to sign. And we all know that that can be done electronically. For example, here on the screen, we've got a sample of what you might see on a web form, where someone checks a box and gives their consent. And we're going to talk about how these consent forms might look different in different contexts here in just a minute. All right. So why do we need that prior express written consent? Well, TCPA penalties can be very steep, $500 to $1,500 per call. While TCPA cases are tracking down compared to their peak a couple years ago, we're still on track for over 3,000 cases being filed this year. And of course, that number doesn't take into account the various cases that are getting resolved pre-filing through settlements just based on demand letters. So companies are still seeing millions of dollars of penalties that they're potentially facing for TCPA violations. Also, that prior express written consent will satisfy the written consent exemption for do not call. And this is really where the FTC is getting involved, because they're focusing their efforts on do not call violations using their TSR authority. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. As I mentioned, lead forms often look a little different in lead gen contexts. And so let's take a look at a few of these. The first is what I call the simple form, right? So the lead generator is doing the calling. They're not trying to get consent for their clients. They are going to do all the calling themselves. Maybe they gather some information and then pass that on as a future lead, but without prior express written consent attached. So that's the simple form up here, the first one where just the lead generator is getting the consent. The second version adds the client, right? So the lead generator and their client are getting the consent to contact. This is probably a fairly common form where there is a very close relationship between the lead generator and its client, almost a captive lead generator in a sense. The next form is a little bit more risky, and I'll explain that in just a moment, but is of a type that we commonly see. So the lead generator themselves is getting consent, and for up to a specified number of partners in a specific space. So in this example, we have the lead generator and up to 4 of its lending partners. So for purposes of this example, we're assuming that this is appearing on some consumer loan website. This language is used in many, many lead forms, and we make strong arguments that this should comply with prior express written consent if the names of the partners who are going to be disclosed are disclosed via a hyperlink. Typically, you see it where it would say lending partners, and then that would be a hyperlink to a list. And so the argument there is the consumer has come to this website. They want to be contacted by lenders. And so when they give their consent, they know full well that 4 people from this list will contact them. And we would argue that that complies. The idea of the hyperlink disclosure comes from the FTC's .com disclosure guidance, which essentially says that you can put important information behind a hyperlink if you're in a space-constrained situation and that hyperlink is properly labeled to allow the consumer to know what's behind it. So again, the argument here would be this is space-constrained. We can't put a bunch of people's names into this list because it would make it too long. The consumer wouldn't read it, so we're putting it behind a hyperlink, and it's very clear by the words lending partners being the link that what's behind it is going to be a list of those lending partners. Now, continuing to move up the risk scale, the first example here on this slide is for the lead generator and up to 4 of its marketing partners. So now let's continue using the idea of the consumer is on a consumer loan website. When we say marketing partners, it's more vague. Maybe this is getting consent for someone who provides insurance, for example, to contact the consumer, right? We know that oftentimes when people buy a house, for example, say they're looking for a loan for a home, it might be a good time to try to sell them life insurance so that they're protected in the event of a death. Here, the argument that it meets prior express written consent is maybe a little weaker in the sense that the consumer may get a call from someone in an industry that they're not expecting. But we would still make the argument that the list that's behind marketing partners, it's hyperlinked behind that, has the names of all the people who might call them. And so the consumer should know that they're going to get called by up to 4 of those people. And the second one on the slide here, this would be what I would say is the highest risk of your standard prior express written consent language because it doesn't give any quantity and it doesn't give any specific business type. This is a very broad, open consent. And we do see this sometimes. We see forms that are set up like this where there may be hundreds of companies that are listed on that marketing partner page. And this has attracted the FTC's attention. As both Stuart and Michelle mentioned, the Bureau Chief of the Consumer Protection Bureau at the FTC, Andrew Smith, has made some comments that show the lead generation industry is squarely in his crosshairs. He's referred to it as an ecosystem of deceit. And I think a lot of people would take offense to that term, people who work really well in this industry and try to do the right thing. But this just goes to show the level of attention that is being paid by the FTC to this industry. And we saw actions matching words. Operation Call It Quits, which just happened a couple weeks ago, consisted of 94 actions coordinated by the FTC, DOJ, and a number of state AGs against callers who allegedly violated Do Not Call and UDAP laws. And there were a number of lead generators or companies relying on leads that they received from lead generators who were targeted in this action. So we are definitely seeing action matching the rhetoric. And as I mentioned, the FTC has been focused on DNC violations, right, because that's where they can really go after calls. In particular, as a subset of that, the main arguments that they're making is that the lead forms that are out there that are being used by lead generators do not sufficiently obtain written consent to meet that exemption under the do not call laws. And so callers who are relying on those need to scrub against the do not call registry. The FTC was also focused on a number of UDAP issues where consumers were alleged to have been misled about the companies to whom they were giving consent or the products that they were going to receive. So we always have to keep UDAP in the back of our mind. As I mentioned, the FTC is very concerned about lead forms. And here are a few of the specific issues that they have. The first is they're saying that multi-caller forms with lists are insufficient. So the example on your screen, right, is the high-risk one that I mentioned earlier, that a lead generator and its marketing partners may contact them, and then there's a list right behind that hyperlink. And so the argument here is that consumers are not anticipating calls about varying products or services. So even if it says marketing partners, which is a vague term, if the consumer is on, say, a website for a consumer loan, they're not expecting to get a call from an insurance company, or even farther removed, say someone selling medical devices, right? So when they're giving that consent, they're doing it within a context where they're expecting to only get communications about the specific product type that they're interested in. Another point that they made is a reasonable consumer isn't willingly agreeing to receive calls from hundreds of companies. Because as I mentioned before, these lists behind the hyperlinks can sometimes have 200, 300, 400 companies on them. And so what the FTC is saying is the consumer they're not willingly doing that. They're clearly not clicking this hyperlink, seeing this list, because if they were, no reasonable consumer would give that type of consent. Additionally, even the language that I mentioned earlier that was maybe more on the lower risk side about the lead generator and 4 of its lending partners, right? So a specific quantity of people in a specific vertical that relates to what the consumer is interested, that also may not be sufficient enough. And the argument there has to do with that hyperlinked list. So if you go back to what I mentioned earlier about the .com disclosure guidance being where we get the basis for using those hyperlinks, those were really issued in the sense of web ads, banner ads, things like that that are truly space constrained. There's only 400 by 600 pixels or something like that, right? So we've got really, really tight space. And so the idea is if you're operating in that tight of a space, okay, maybe you can put some stuff behind a hyperlink. With a lead form, you're not limited, is the argument. That if you're putting it on a website, you've got all the space on that website. So there isn't the same rationale for needing to put it behind a hyperlink. You should just put it right up front in the consent language right before the consumer. And if it makes that language run on an extra line or two, so be it. Now, the FTC, I don't think, has fully considered that even in this type of context, a company might have 100 lending partners that it's going to match based on what the lending partners offer and what the consumer is looking for to try to get the consumer the best possible deal, the best possible match, but they're not going to know at the time that they're crafting the language here who that's going to be. And so there is a real consumer benefit element to the flexibility. And that's one of the things that I think, PACE is going to be trying to educate the FTC and other regulators on, which is that consumer benefit to the way some of these forms are structured. The other thing I'll mention, because I am talking a lot about the FTC, but we have heard through the grapevine that there are some states that are starting to take similar approaches. One in particular, we heard about Pennsylvania reaching out to some companies because they are starting to take the same position as the FTC, but under the Pennsylvania state laws. And so this could be the start of a trend. We know that FTC and state AG's offices work very closely together. And so when we're thinking about these lead forms, we need to think about it not just at the federal level, but also at the state level. A couple other issues that the FTC has had. One relates to incentivized form completion, right? So these are forms where a consumer receives an entry into a sweepstakes with the promise of a gift card or a product, and they get that in exchange for completing the form. And the FTC is starting to take the position that those incentives likely negate that consent. The primary argument for it is that there's such a distraction. The consumer is so focused on the incentive that they're not actually paying attention to what the consent language says. They're just checking the box and moving on. And so it's rendering, let me rephrase it, it's creating a clear and conspicuous disclosure issue. Because there's such a distraction, the disclosure language is not clear and conspicuous. There's also an argument that we've seen, not so much from the FTC, but from consumer groups that are also saying that the promises of these awards are overriding the consumer's ability to make a rational choice. So the consumer is so driven by the desire to get that gift card or participate in that sweepstakes that they're not able to make a rational decision. Another issue that we see, and the FTC has really zoned in on this one, is companies who promise an entry into a sweepstakes or promise a gift card, and that sweepstakes or gift card never materialize. So those are just kind of straight up fraud and deception kind of issues. So any companies that are doing that are obviously going to be targeted for enforcement. Then one of the other things we've seen lately is forms that are set up to look like another company's website. So for example, the lead form might be set up to look like it's from Amazon. Say it promises an Amazon gift card. If you complete the form, it uses Amazon colors. It uses the same fonts that Amazon uses. So the consumer thinks that they're giving their information to Amazon, and there's nothing in the disclosure that dispels them of that notion. And so it's essentially creating an area, a zone of deception to get the consumer to complete the form. And that's obviously an issue. Going hand in hand with that, we are seeing a groundswell of privacy regulation. And I believe there is a webinar coming up on this at some point in the future. I'm forgetting the date. But to talk about California's new Consumer Privacy Act and the efforts that we're seeing among states and at the federal level to enhance privacy protections. If a consumer thinks that they're giving information to company A, that information is actually going to company B, that creates a privacy issue, a data privacy issue and privacy disclosure issue. So if anyone on the call has any vendors that are working for them, or maybe they're using forms that are set up like this, you might want to take a look at those. And courts haven't been silent on this either, although I will say courts are more focused on the clear and conspicuous angle. So what we're seeing coming out of the courts is the disclosure really needs to be above the submit button, particularly with consumers viewing things on mobile devices that have more limited screen real estate. If they scroll down to the submit button, they're likely not to see a disclosure that's under it because they're probably not scrolling past it. So courts are saying that disclosure really needs to be above the submit button, otherwise the consumer probably doesn't see it. Additionally, the consumer needs to take some sort of affirmative action to demonstrate their consent, and this kind of goes along with e-sign. Right, so with the e-sign Act, which allows consumers to provide consent electronically, they need to take some sort of action to evidence their signature. Maybe just hitting that submit button isn't enough. And so there was a case recently. It's still within pending litigation, so I'm not going to get into the parties and whatnot. But where the court looked at a consent form and said, well, the consumer didn't need to check a box. All they had to do was hit this button. And the button said continue. And in this instance, the disclosure language was actually above the button. And it was black text against a white background, right? It stood out. But the court said, you know, when the consumer hit that continue button, that's not enough to evidence their consent, that they actually agreed to this disclosure that was above the button. And so you see I've got some words here on the screen: submit, next, continue, I agree, call me. These are some of the words that we often see on these submit buttons. And if you're this court, or in this court, that word continue sounds like it's not enough. You probably need a checkbox. Likewise, next, I would say probably fits into that same bucket. Whereas if the button said I agree, or the button said call me, maybe the court would have said that was enough, because it was clear when the consumer pushed that button, they were giving their agreement for you to contact them. So it's very important to have your lead forms or your vendor's lead forms reviewed by counsel to really see if how they're structured is in alignment with the latest court positions on clear and conspicuous disclosure. So what can you do? Well, first, and this is probably the safest route, although it might be hard to do, is disclose the potential callers in the actual language. So, for example, on screen here, we've got a form that would allow for 4 callers in addition to the lead generator, so the lead generator plus 4 clients. And their names are all disclosed here. As I mentioned, this could be really hard to do if you don't know who the consumer is going to match with, or if you've got a number of clients, right? If you've got 100 clients, because if you start putting 100 names in this language, I guarantee you the FTC is going to say, well, now you've cluttered up the language so much, it's not clear and conspicuous. So this really only works in kind of some limited contexts. One option could be if you can code a website to dynamically match. So if you are going to be matching that consumer with some specific companies from that list of 100, you might do that. If you're going to be collecting leads for multiple product types, use separate consents. Right, again, as I mentioned, the FTC is concerned about, well, the consumer's on a website for product A, now they're getting called about product B, which is not what they're interested in. But sometimes product B can have some synergies with product A. For example, again, going back to, someone's looking for a home loan, and maybe life insurance is a product that fits with that. So maybe break your consent up into 2 different consents, one for each type. And that improves the argument that well, the consumer should know who they're getting consent from. If you absolutely have to include a list of multiple companies, so there's just no way that you can narrow it down to just a handful, I would say also keep that list short. Maybe try to keep that list to maybe a dozen or 20 companies, something that's at least a little more arguable that a consumer would willingly give consent for a certain number, right, again, so specifying, 4 lending partners, and that lending partner list now being narrower, that a consumer might actually want that. Of course, put that disclosure above the submit button. This form here is actually something that the FTC mocked up to show how forms don't comply, but I wanted to put it on here just to give us something to look at, right? So in this example, we've got the information the form is collecting, we've got the submit button, so we would want to put our prior express written consent disclosure between the phone box and the submit button. And given the way courts are moving towards requiring true affirmative action to demonstrate consent, to demonstrate their signature, I would always recommend putting a checkbox, putting in something that the consumer is taking a second step to do. Again, you can argue that, do you preface the consent language with something like, by clicking submit, you have agreed, blah, 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 blah. I think that is a little higher risk, but also has a bit better argument than the case that was previously that I was previously discussing. The disclosure in that case said, I agree to blah, blah, blah. So it didn't begin with an action. So you can maybe argue if the language starts by clicking submit, I agree, dot, dot, dot. I think that's a better argument. Still not quite as tight as actually requiring the person to check a box. The other thing about checkboxes that I will point out, we often see a lot of them pre-checked. That is not the way to do that, because if you're wanting to capture that the person actively consented, they need to take that action of checking the box. So if it's pre-checked, they're not doing that. A couple other things. You may consider not incentivizing form completion with sweepstakes or gift card offers. If, again, thinking about the rationale, right, why does the FTC have an issue with this? Well, because it's distracting the consumer from the consent language. Maybe you could do it if you make the consent language really obvious. So you put it there, you require them to check the box, you make it big, you take steps to pull focus to the consent language from the sweepstakes or gift card offer. Again, this is a gray area, but there is one thing I can tell you that is black and white. If you promise a consumer an entry into a sweepstakes or you promise them a gift card, you had better fulfill it. If you're not doing that, that is pretty much a straight-up violation. So if you are going to make a promise, you got to fulfill it. Another thing, try not to bundle your consent with other disclosures. We often see the prior express written consent language bundled with an acceptance of a privacy policy in terms of use. The consumer really probably needs to be able to accept those separately. We have had some states, just in our practice, we've seen some states push back, and we've seen the FTC push a little bit that when you start adding extra things to the prior express written consent disclosure, it muddies that disclosure, and it makes it harder for the consumer to really understand. So I would suggest that you break those into two different disclosures. I would also refrain from putting in a bunch of miscellaneous information into that prior express written consent disclosure. I have seen some PEWC disclosures that are 50, 60 words long because the lead generator is really trying to bury, because the actual prior express language, consent language is always in the middle of that giant block of text, right? They're trying to bury that amongst a bunch of other disclosures. Let's not do that. That reduces the clear and conspicuous disclosure. If you're a buyer of leads, another thing to keep in mind, make sure your lead generators are complying with the latest best practices. So for this presentation, we've pretty much talked about what lead generators should do in structuring their forms and in their handling of consumers. But if you are a buyer of leads or you're using a lead generator, always do your due diligence. Make sure that they're a good, reputable company and that they're complying with the latest best practices. And so with that, I do want to leave some time for questions. I see we've got a couple in the box. So Chris, I don't know if you're still on the line, or Stuart, I know you all had received some additional questions. Let me take the
Josh,
ones in the box here.
Yeah, start these, okay?
Yeah. So let me start with the ones in the box. So we have one, if the prior express written consent verbiage states by clicking continue below does not have a checkbox, would that not be construed as affirmative action in the context of the court example you spoke about? I think I mentioned this earlier. I think it is a much better argument if you start the language with if you take a certain action, that constitutes consent. So by clicking continue below, you give your consent, da-da-da-da-da. I do think that is a much better argument than the way the form is set up in that case. Please include in agreement consent form the e-sign act and in particular disclosures required before electronic signature is valid in any transaction agreement. Does the transaction agreement carry over to opt-in consent? Again, when you're getting that consent, you are doing it electronically using what's allowed under e-sign. We always recommend that our clients put in the language that the person is giving their electronic signature by checking that box or taking whatever step that they are giving their electronic signature. It's a good to do. I don't know that it necessarily always wins the day. But it certainly makes it a better argument. Individual also points out that the FCC had previously considered avatar or soundboard technology to not be pre-recorded messages and then reverse that position. So I'll make one tweak to that statement. The FTC was the entity that had issued the official letter saying that soundboard was not pre-recorded, was not the use of pre-recorded messages, and then reversed that position. And I will tell you, since they reversed that position last year, we are seeing courts following along with that. So definitely something to keep in mind. So Stuart, what were some of the questions that you had previously received?
One is, I operate a platform that lead generators use to call consumers. Do I need to be concerned?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And we have seen the FTC take actions against platform providers under a theory of assisting and facilitating liability. So basically the argument is if you are turning a blind eye to red flags that your platform is being used for illegal activity, then you can be held liable as well. And so, what are some red flags you should look for? If you're getting, for example, a lot of subpoenas related to a particular client that's using your platform, that might be a red flag. If you do your due diligence on that client and you find that they've got a bunch of lawsuits that have been filed against them related to TCPA violations, that might be a red flag. if you see that they've got AVCs that really restrict what they're doing, and what they're doing seems to not be in line with their AVCs, that's a red flag. So this goes back to this due diligence concept, right? So even if you are just a platform provider, you need to just keep an eye out. If you're getting lots of consumer complaints, regulatory investigations, those are red flags that need to be addressed.
Okay, and someone asked, is PACE doing anything to help with this issue? Maybe Michelle would want to.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Josh, do you wanna, why don't you give a high-level view of the white paper that you have been working so hard on, and I have appreciated so much. And why don't we then kind of talk about what our next steps are? And I'm happy to talk about that if you want to start with the white paper.
Yeah, sure. So we have been working on a white paper on this issue that we're going to use to educate regulators about the lead generation industry, how it really helps consumers, right? How there is a strong consumer benefit to these lead gen systems, and also helping them understand that we do recognize there are some bad actors in the space. There are some activities, like I mentioned earlier, about like mimicking another company's website, or offering sweepstakes or gift cards and then failing to actually fulfill those. There are some bad actors that are doing some bad things, and they do need to be stopped. So what we've done in the white paper is we walk through that background. We point out that the things that we see that are issues, and then we are working on a set of self-regulatory principles that can help guide how lead generators and their clients work, to make sure that they're staying not only within the bounds of the law, but also within the bounds of what we might consider best practices. So that's the white paper that's in progress. And then Michelle, I'll let you explain the other efforts that are going along with that.
Yeah, so this is an issue that has been brought to our attention by a number of different members and has high interest for our industry. So this is something we've taken up as a priority over the next future endeavors for educational efforts with regulators. And so we have started a lead generation task force that will be convened here very shortly. We are working with other associations that are also interested in the lead generation issue. We will shortly thereafter be meeting with folks in the regulatory offices. It'll be our goal to meet with the FTC first, and then from their state AGs, as I've mentioned. And we are currently working on meetings with the FCC related to a number of the TCPA topics, and this will certainly be part of that. If we have folks out there that are interested in participating in the task force, I would ask that you contact either Stuart or me, and our emails, I think, are included in the slide. Josh's is there, so you can forward it to Josh as well, and he'll get it to us. So the task force will, the folks that choose to be involved with the task force will have individualized task force meetings that will address where our efforts are and get input on how we should proceed based on what the interests are of the task force. And the impact fund is being used to fund this effort. So those of you that are interested in contributing, please reach out to Stuart regarding the impact fund. But this is a really important issue, and it's something that we have to have clarity on. It's something we have to have the regulators on the same page with us to make sure that folks that are obtaining consent are doing it in a way that they don't have to worry about the unknown or future TCPA lawsuits or actions by regulators. So please reach out to us if this is an area of interest to you.
Shall we have two
Stuart,
more
are there any other questions?
Yeah.
Well, there's two more questions.
Yeah, we got two more.
Let's limit it to these two, and then we're going to end this. Okay?
Yeah. So got a question about is this as relevant on the B2B side as as it is on the B2C side? It is, I would say it's still relevant, but the FTC's enforcement is certainly much more focused on the B2C side, where you're going to see for B2B purposes is private plaintiffs arguing that you don't have prior express written consent to use an ATDS to call them. That's more where you're going to see it on the B2B side. And just as an example, the recent Supreme Court case related to the physician's desk reference was a call that was made to a doctor trying to sell a physician's desk reference. So you do still see these happen in the B2B side, but certainly the FTC and state AG focus is on the B2C side. And then we have another question about serial litigators in this space. Michelle, you're probably a little more tied in on the litigation side.
Yeah.
Who are some of the names that you keep seeing popping up, either attorneys or plaintiffs?
Well, so it's all the usual suspects out there that I'm sure that the names are well known to this group and the attorneys that represent them. And I can tell you this is becoming an issue in almost every TCPA class action that we're defending. The first item that's requested in demand letter is, well, actually money is the first thing that's requested. But then after that, if they ask if there's consent for those telephone calls, which they claim never occurred, that it be provided. And so, we're relying on those lead generation forms. There are services out there, such as Jernia's Lead ID and Trusted Forum are two I know off the top of my head that will provide evidence of the consumer experience as they were filling out lead forms. So there are ways that those are produced very frequently in litigation. But then for some of those examples that Josh was providing that are questionable or that the FTC questioned, I guess really is what I should say, the serial litigants are pushing back on that and saying that we don't believe that this provided consent. So this is an issue that is being litigated in a number of cases right now. Some of the larger lead generators in the space are dealing with this issue and defending their consent. And so this is not a decided question by any stretch of the imagination. And those larger companies that have been generating leads using some of these forms are still standing by those forms and defending them. So we'll see how this comes out in the next, I would say, year in the litigation front. We're going to see district courts that are starting to take a position on consent. So the very short answer to your question is yes, this is very much an issue in the serial litigant, or vexatious litigators is what I like to call them, space.
Well, that's all the time we have today. I'd like to thank Michelle and Josh. This was very informative, and I hope everybody I guess isn't as scared as they should be when it comes to this issue. These webinars always leave us a little bit with a lot of anxiousness. The recording of the webinar will be available on the PACE website in just a few days. And as a reminder, our Washington Summit is September 22nd to 24th at the Intercontinental on the Wharf in D.C. And the early bird registration is open, and other information about the summit can be found on the PACE website. And then don't forget to check out all the other membership opportunities on our website, like our benchmark portal, operational certifications, online resource directory, opportunities to submit content, etc. And we hope to see you very soon at another PACE webinar, national, regional, chapter event. Thank you so much for your time, and everyone have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart.